In laboratory tests, well-brewed compost liquids have been measured at over 1 billion living microorganisms in a single milliliter. That means 1 cup can carry more biological life than many chemically managed fields contain, across entire patches of soil. When applied to depleted ground, microbial activity has been observed rebounding in days instead of seasons. Roots begin forming fungal partnerships. Nutrient cycling restarts. Water retention improves. And this liquid requires no synthetic chemicals. It costs almost nothing to make. For centuries, it was brewed in barrels and buckets to rebuild soil. Then agriculture industrialized, and biology was replaced with formulas. And this liquid disappeared. Now, as soils degrade and fertilizer costs rise, researchers are returning to what was abandoned. This is compost tea, the liquid we stopped brewing, and what it actually did to the ground. The archive opens in the gardens of ancient China over 2,000 years ago. The archive opens in the gardens of ancient China over 2,000 years ago. Farmers there did not view soil as an inert surface. They saw it as a living membrane, breathing beneath their feet. Every season, they returned organic matter to the ground, but they also poured liquids onto it: fermented plant extracts, steeped manure water, infusions drawn from forest floors. These were not fertilizers in the modern sense. They were inoculants. The goal was not to feed the plant directly. It was to keep the soil alive so the soil could do the feeding. This same understanding appeared across continents. In Japan, farmers brewed liquids from composted fish and rice bran. In Europe, manure tea was applied to orchards for centuries. The practice was so common, it required no name. It was simply what you did to maintain ground that had been worked for generations. Soil was not a medium. It was a partner. The liquid was the offering that kept the partnership alive, but somewhere along the way, we stopped listening to the ground. And when we did, we forgot how fertility was actually being made. Long before fertilizer factories existed, fertility was something brewed at home. Gardeners filled barrels with water and added whatever organic material was rich with life. Finished compost, aged manure, leaf mold pulled from the forest floor. They let it sit for days, sometimes weeks, sometimes stirring, sometimes not. What formed was not a nutrient concentrate. It was a living infusion. Billions of microorganisms multiplied in that dark water. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes. All extracted from healthy decomposing matter and suspended in a form that could be poured directly onto soil. Soil science research measured bacterial populations in well-brewed compost tea at over 1 billion cells per milliliter. Fungal strands stretched through the liquid in networks invisible to the naked eye. This was not a product, it was a process, and every household with a compost pile had access to it. The recipe varied by region and generation, passed down not in books, but in practice. No patent, no purchase. Just observation, time, and trust in the quiet intelligence of decay. But the world was about to forget how powerful that simplicity had been, and what 1 cup of this liquid was actually carrying. The miracle of compost tea was not in its volume, it was in its density of life. A single cup could carry more microorganisms than an entire field of chemically managed soil. When poured onto depleted ground, it did not add nutrition in the conventional sense. It reintroduced the workers, bacteria that convert atmospheric nitrogen into forms roots can absorb, fungi that extend root reach by hundreds of times, and protozoa that consume bacteria and release nitrogen in plant-available form. These organisms do not just exist in soil, they run it. Without them, minerals remain locked in place. Structure collapses, water drains too fast or pools too long. 1 cup of properly brewed tea carried the biological starter kit that dead soil had lost. It was not magic. It was ecology. And it worked because healthy soil was never about chemistry alone. It was about relationships, tiny organisms forming networks, trading nutrients, protecting roots, cycling matter into life. The tea simply gave that network a second chance to rebuild what had been broken. But as farming scaled up, this way of thinking became inconvenient. Biology was slowly replaced by something easier to control. Plants do not absorb most nutrients by themselves. They rely on a web of biological middlemen working beneath the surface. Mycorrhizal fungi attach to roots and extend outward, pulling in phosphorus and micronutrients the roots could never reach alone. Bacteria fix nitrogen or break down organic compounds into molecules plants can uptake. Protozoa graze on bacteria, releasing nitrogen as waste right in the root zone. Without these partners, plants struggle even in soil rich with minerals. Compost tea reintroduces these organisms to ground where they have been diminished or destroyed. Research from Oregon State found that compost tea applications increased microbial biomass in treated soils within days. Fungal networks began forming. Nutrient cycling resumed. Plants grown in biologically active soil showed improved resistance to disease, stronger root systems, and more efficient water use. This is not theory. It is measurable ecology. Compost tea does not bypass biology. It restores it. The liquid carries no synthetic inputs. Its value lies in what it brings back to life. But when chemistry became king, this living logic was written off as folklore. The cost of that dismissal is still being paid today. Traditional growers did not apply compost tea the way modern farms spray chemicals. They used it with intention and timing. At planting, the liquid was poured into holes before seedlings were placed. The roots met living soil from the very first moment. On compost piles, tea was poured to accelerate decomposition. The added microorganisms sped the breakdown of carbon and released nutrients faster. In orchards, it was poured in rings beneath the drip line of trees, feeding the fungal networks that fruit trees depend on for mineral exchange. Across vegetable beds, it was applied after tillage or disturbance to repopulate what had been disrupted. Some growers diluted it heavily and used it as a foliar spray, introducing beneficial bacteria to leaf surfaces where they could outcompete disease organisms. This was not guesswork. It was pattern recognition handed down over generations. The tea was applied when soil had been stressed, when seasons changed, when new ground needed activation. It was maintenance disguised as simplicity. But maintenance does not sell, and a new model was rising that had no room for anything made in a backyard. The 20th century changed everything. Agriculture industrialized. Yields became national priorities. Chemists discovered that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium could be synthesized and applied directly to soil. Growth responded. Crops surged. The Green Revolution was born. But in that transformation, something else disappeared. The biological layer was no longer necessary to understand. Fertility was reduced to 3 letters. NPK, a formula. An input. A product that could be manufactured, packaged, and sold at scale. Farmers no longer needed to observe soil life. They only needed to follow application rates. Fields that once required years of careful building now seemed to produce overnight. Compost tea, with its variability, its slow rhythm, its refusal to standardize, could not compete. It was not wrong. It was simply unmarketable. In a world optimizing for speed and profit, anything that could not be sold at volume became invisible. The liquid that had kept soil alive for centuries faded out of practice. Not because it failed, because it did not fit a system built on dependence rather than partnership. And the soil began to pay the price. Not immediately, but everywhere. Within decades, the consequences surfaced. Soil organic matter declined across industrial farmland. Without microbial life cycling carbon, the ground lost its sponge. Water ran off instead of soaking in. Minerals leached instead of cycling. Studies from the United Nations estimate that 1/3 of the world's arable soil is now degraded. Microbial diversity collapsed in chemically managed fields. Monocultures and synthetic inputs created sterile layers where only the crop and the chemical existed. Roots no longer partnered with fungi. They simply absorbed what was poured on them. Yields stayed high only because inputs kept increasing, but efficiency dropped. More fertilizer was needed each year to produce the same result. The ground that once fed itself now demanded constant intervention. The living networks that once made soil self-renewing had been replaced by dependency, and when the inputs stopped or failed, the soil had nothing left to give. Compost tea would have maintained the biology that held everything together, but brewing had stopped. The farms forgot. And beneath the surface, the silence spread deeper each season. The system could not run forever. The reason compost tea disappeared explains why the damage spread so fast. Compost tea could not be industrialized. That was its fatal flaw in a system that valued scale above all else. The liquid depended entirely on source material, and no two batches were ever identical. Brewing time mattered. Temperature mattered. Oxygen levels determined whether the tea stayed beneficial or turned harmful. A well-made tea was alive with aerobic organisms, and a poorly made one could breed pathogens. This variability made commercial production nearly impossible. You could not bottle it and ship it across the country. It had no shelf life. It could not be certified in consistent doses. And because it worked through biology, not chemistry, results were harder to measure in the short term. Industrial agriculture wanted guarantees. It wanted labels. It wanted inputs that performed identically from field to field. Compost tea offered none of that, so it quietly disappeared from mainstream farming. It survived in small gardens, in permaculture circles, in the hands of growers who never stopped paying attention. But for most of the world, the practice became a relic, until the soil itself started demanding something different. The ground is speaking now. Farmers facing rising fertilizer costs, declining yields, and soil too tired to respond are searching for answers outside the chemical model. And they are finding compost tea waiting, where it always was. Research institutions that once dismissed microbial agriculture are now funding serious studies on soil biology. The results confirm what traditional growers never doubted. Healthy soil is not a container for chemicals. It is an ecosystem. Compost tea is being tested for disease suppression, nutrient cycling, and drought resilience. In regenerative agriculture circles, it has become a foundational tool for rebuilding what industrial farming stripped away. Small-scale growers are brewing again. Market farmers are inoculating transplants. Orchardists are restoring fungal networks beneath their trees. The practice is not returning as nostalgia. It is returning as necessity. When the chemistry stops working, biology is the only option left. One cup at a time, the soil is being reawakened. The liquid that could not be sold is now being made again in backyards and barns and farms that remember what the ground was always supposed to be. Compost tea does not replace fertility. It restores the conditions that create it. One cup does not deliver nutrients like a synthetic formula. It delivers life. Organisms unlock minerals already present in the soil. Networks build structure and hold water. Cycles turn death into growth, without any outside input. The ground was never meant to be fed. It was meant to be alive. When it is alive, it feeds itself and everything planted in it. This is the knowledge that was buried when agriculture became an industry. Fertility was turned into a product. Soil was turned into a medium. The living layer in between was forgotten entirely. But forgetting does not erase what is true. Compost tea still works. It works because biology has not changed. Only our attention has shifted. Now it is shifting back, not because of sentiment, but because the old way stopped working and the older way never did. The cup we threw away is being lifted again, and beneath the surface, something is waking up, because soil does not die. It waits.